This month's issue voter bill is all about keeping the lights on, literally. They say that lightning never strikes twice, but Congress sure does. After last year's marathon debate of clean energy and transmission reform, lawmakers are back at it again with a new approach to our grid. Today's bill, the Grid Power Act, officially HR 1047, and unofficially the sequel that no one asked for, but everyone will definitely be arguing about.
Yeah, it's got all the ingredients, high stakes, partisan votes, and enough acronyms to short circuit your brain.
Love these acronyms and these bills.
Love our
Uh,
acronyms.
Before we dive in today, Stephen, we've talked a lot about energy this year. So let's just do a brief overview of what we have talked about, some of the main concerns here.
We've done a lot of stuff on cars, haven't we? Electric cars and the move towards electric cars, and obviously had the burdens that that places on the electricity grid. It's obviously
Mhm.
one of the big problems. But also, how do you charge them and where do you charge them? All those kind of things. We spoke last year about the various efforts through the Biden administration to actually improve grid access and to make our grid more flexible, more responsive.
Yeah, we've also talked just a lot about the limitations of our grid, which I think is something that a lot of people aren't super aware of. And we make this strong push towards we need more
Hmm.
renewables, we need better sources of energy,
Absolutely.
and that is definitely part of it. But another huge issue here that is hard to even take into account is because our grid is so old, it's not just a matter of spinning up a solar plant or spinning up a wind power plant
Hmm.
and immediately there you go. Bob's your uncle, you can use the energy. A lot of the time, our grid can't even take more energy, or it's really difficult to feed that energy into the grid. And so it's just kind of a no winning area, it seems.
Yes, and the grid isn't smart enough is one of the big
Hmm.
problems, isn't it? So when you have a lot of renewables in your mix, then they are variable. They'll come and go. They're intermittent, and your grid needs to be able to cope with that and very quickly switch between different sources of electricity. And the American electricity grid just isn't up to that task. We also spoke about small modular reactors, of course, which is something very keen, and we'll come into the bill that we're talking about today as well. So that's a source of energy that should be quicker to build than conventional nuclear power stations, but is dependable because you can switch it
Hmm.
on and off. You can always have it there, which is a lot of what the Republicans are talking about these days. So yeah, lots and lots of effort about this, but it's not only in the US as well. It's obviously a global issue. So Europe has really been struggling with this because obviously European countries tend to be very green. We all throw ourselves quite heavily into the whole green revolution when it first came
Hmm.
up. What 10 years ago now, 20 years ago, when things really first started kicking off. But it's been a very rocky road in Europe. And largely, we had obviously the war in Ukraine that meant that all of a sudden all the gas supplies were cut off. And we have a lot of gas-fired power stations. We had to find other sources of gas and desperately tried to mix up our grids a bit more, get a lot more wind power, which is very
Yeah.
popular, certainly in the UK, more than solar. Because it's not very sunny, but we have lots of wind, so we have lots of wind power. But it's difficult because at the same time you've got this power increasing, we have the same problems about connecting new power stations. They say it takes about 10 years to get a new offshore wind plant connected to the grid,
Mm.
which just seems crazy, doesn't it? I don't
Yeah.
really understand why. I remember looking at some reports about the cost of building pylons, and if you have like an offshore wind farm in Scotland, which is where it tends
Hmm.
to be very windy, you're going to need to build your pylons across very beautiful parts of the country, and the people who live there object to having this big march of pylons. Now you can put them underground, but that's like 10 times more expensive, and obviously you then have to dig up all the ground as well, so that's another problem.
Right.
So it's just simple, quite prosaic issues like that coupled with very complex issues about this variability of the grid.
Well, I think with that, let's get right into it. So, what is this Grid Power Act and why
Yeah.
does everyone keep calling it this reliability bill instead of another energy bill?
Well, HR 1047, which is actually called the Guaranteeing Reliability Through the Interconnection of Dispatchable Power Act, or
Oh.
GRID. It just squeaked through the House in September, 206 votes to 206, completely along partisan lines. Obviously, the Republicans supporting, Democrats opposing. And it's basically the Republican majority's answer to what they see as an overly renewable heavy energy agenda. So instead of prioritizing clean power, which is what we've seen in recent years, particularly through the Biden administration, this This one prioritizes reliable power. So
Mm.
think gas, nuclear, hydro, even advanced geothermal, anything that can run when the sun's down and the wind's not cooperating. So these power sources are known in the industry as dispatchable, hence the dispatchable in the title of this bill. Energy sources that cannot just be switched on and off as and when they're needed are called intermittent. So that's your wind and your solar and so
Okay, okay. Very good terminology for us to get here at the front.
on.
And this is kind of the grid version of these are the adults in the room, if you will.
Exactly. If those adults are largely unconcerned with climate change and pollutants generated by fossil fuel energy sources, uh, of course the Republicans are. So the bill actually orders the FERC, that's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, to overhaul the interconnection process so that dispatchable projects get to jump the line. So right now, the grid's queue for new projects is absolutely jammed. So we're talking years of waiting for approval to plug in.
And like we mentioned, plugging in is an issue in itself altogether. But
Absolutely.
okay. So and that was one of the Biden administration's big pain points. They try to clear the way for these renewables and storage. So this is kind of a flip of priorities, right?
Yes, yes, that's right. It absolutely does flip the priorities. So, under Biden era guidance, the FERC pushed to streamline things for renewables to hit those decarbonization goals faster.
Mm.
Republicans are basically saying, hey, that's great, but we can't run hospitals on wishful thinking when the grid's unstable. So, this bill says reliability first, carbon second. So, it's a massive philosophical and policy shift.
Okay, okay. So, going from decarbonization goals to just trying to keep the lights on goals almost.
Yeah.
So, politically, this has been a hot one. What's the pitch of the bill sponsor, Representative Troy Balderson from Ohio?
Well, Balderson's argument is pretty straightforward. Demand for power is skyrocketing, but our ability to generate reliable electricity isn't keeping up. He says that the Grid Power Act gives operators the tools they need to connect these critical projects, which for him are largely gas and nuclear plants that keep the grid balanced and hopefully lower costs for household and businesses.
Okay, so that's the sales pitch there, but what's the
Mm.
pushback? Because I think I can already hear Democrats shouting line cutting.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So that was the main argument on the House floor when this was debated. The Democrats said that the bill would let fossil fuel plants cut the line ahead of wind and solar projects that are shovel ready and waiting. So basically, they see it as a step backwards, a way to lock in more carbon emissions under the banner of reliability. And there's some truth there. If this becomes law, it'll almost certainly slow the renewable queue and accelerate gas or nuclear approvals.
Okay, all right. That definitely makes sense. So it's kind of reliability versus renewables. It isn't just this vibe shift though. It sounds like it actually has a few procedural teeth.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It gives the FERC 180 days, just 6 months, to produce final rules and then requires updates every 5 years. So that's a pretty tight turnaround for
Yeah.
the matters of this complexity. And it forces the FERC to get stakeholder feedback before making any changes. So utilities, states, and industry groups will all have to weigh in. And crucially, a lot of the industry groups are those groups that certainly fell out of favor with the Biden administration. So
Mm.
think coal industry groups and things like that. So those old fossil fuel or organizations that had been sidelined. And it's partly why the Electric Power Supply Association is cheering. So their CEO, Todd Snitchler, called it a balanced and appropriate approach, basically saying it keeps all sides in the room while addressing reliability concerns.
Okay. Meanwhile, the environmental groups are, shall we say, less enthusiastic.
Yes, that's the understatement of the year. They're worried that the bill undermines clean energy investment just as the US is finally scaling it up. So groups like NRDC and the Sierra Club argue it sends the wrong signal internationally, especially since Europe and Australia are struggling with the same balancing act between renewables and backup power. So if you look a bit further afield, look at China, for example. So China is often seen, certainly on the right, people say, look at China, they're opening a new coal-fired power station every week. They don't care. But at the same time, they are building like these gargantuan renewable projects, like
Mm.
huge solar farms and massive wind farms, and they're damming rivers to get hydroelectric. So they are going hell for leather for all ways of generating this electricity. And at the same
Mm.
time, of course, they're dominating the world market in these new renewable technologies that are coming through. So one of the risks of doing this, of course, is saying, well, we're just going to sit back and we're going to rely on gas and nuclear, and to be honest, coal, and we're going to let China have the renewables market.
It's so interesting. Last year I was in Ecuador and they power a lot of Ecuador from a hydroelectric plant, and they've been having a
Mhm.
bad drought there. And when we were there, there was kind of rolling blackouts for 14 hours a day. And I mean, it was crazy. And it's just one of those things where that is something where you just don't over index.
Yeah.
That's something that we're trying to think of here a little bit, but then it seems like we're just kind of
Mm.
over indexing on what we know works and isn't something that is
Yeah.
intermediate. So how does this compare globally? I know we talked about China, but where does Europe kind of come into all of this?
Europe really did try to go all in on renewables, but when transmission lagged behind, they ended up having to subsidize gas plants to keep the lights on. Australia's been doing the same thing. It's been scrambling to add firming capacity for the same reason. So the Grid Power Act actually borrows from that playbook. It's
Mm,
saying, let's fix reliability before we hit a crisis. It's a preemptive move, or at least that's the hope. And I think it may well be informed by the Spanish crisis last year that people may be aware of, when the lights really did go out. The entire
hmm.
Spanish power grid just fell over, and no one was quite sure why. But it looks as though the reason why it fell over wasn't that there wasn't enough power, because they were sucking power in from all over the place. It was because the grid just couldn't cope with these variabilities. It wasn't modern enough. It wasn't flexible enough
Mm,
to actually cope with all the different sources of energy coming in, and it
hmm.
shut down. So that's
Hmm.
obviously they're desperate to avoid that, because if your grid falls over like that and the power goes out even for a few hours, obviously the economic impact and the social impact can be enormous.
Yes, absolutely. So if this passes, what actually happens? Are we talking big shifts in the power mix?
If it passes, then yes, we'd likely see shorter wait times for gas and nuclear projects and longer ones for wind and solar. Utilities would be able to justify reshuffling the queue as long as they could prove it improves reliability. Developers counting on Biden era reforms would have to rethink financing and project timeline. And that's why it's such a big deal. It changes not just what gets built, but when and how. And as we know, with these huge infrastructure projects, what counts is consistency and a long timeline. So you can
Mm-hmm.
see ahead. It's going to take me 5 years to build this thing. Is the policy environment going to be the same in 5 years' time than it is now? And if not, then people will pause and they just won't invest in the projects.
Yes, and I mean, will the government even be choosing to fund projects that they've already chosen to fund and all of these things that we're kind of
Yeah,
dealing with in the US right now? It's not
that's
just the
right.
uncertainty abroad, it's a lot of uncertainty internally as well.
Absolutely.
All right,
Absolutely.
well, let's talk a reality check here. Does this thing have a shot in the Senate?
Well, not a big one, really. So, Senate Democrats are unlikely to back it, given the House vote was strictly partisan. But some moderate Democrats might see some political upside here. With energy bills climbing, there's real voter fatigue around anything that looks
Mm-hmm.
anti-reliability. So, Democrats might be wary of opposing a bill that promises to actually bring the cost of energy down for your average user. Even if it doesn't pass, though, the debate itself is a
Mm-hmm.
sign of where energy policy is heading. The Biden era build clean, fast approach is being replaced by a more cautious, keep the lights on tonight mindset.
Okay, all right. So, whether or not the Grid Power Act survives, the conversation about how we build power and what kind of power is definitely not over solved or done with.
Oh, absolutely not. No, the grid fight is kind of America's energy policy in miniature. Climate
Mm,
goals on one side,
yeah.
real world physics on the other. And sooner or later, they've got to plug into the same outlet.
Nicely said. All right, so that's the GRID Act, or HR 1047, the latest attempt to keep America's grid reliable, resilient, and maybe even bipartisan someday.
Ooh, hope springs eternal, just not necessarily renewable.
Well, that's it for this episode of Beyond the Bill Number. Check out the full issue voter analysis and follow along with every federal, state, and bill at billtrack50.com.
And remember, the power may flicker, but the legislation never stops.